You must have heard the joke, both true for Finns and Estonians, that when the 2 meter distancing was ended, everyone said, "Thank God we can go back to 3 meters."
That's a new one for me. It's very funny. Yeah.
Hi, welcome to the show. My pleasure to be here as your host. Just call me T+. This show is called InnoMinds, a forum for leaders in tech and politics to discuss how to solve today's problems with today's tools. Today, our special guest is Lukas Ilves. Lukas is Estonia's Undersecretary for Digital Transformation. I'm also here with Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Digital Minister. Today, we talk about how Taiwan and Estonia became pioneers of digital governance. Before we get started, I want to introduce our two guests today. Lukas's job is to oversee the ongoing digital transformation of his country, Estonia, where you can vote online, get married online, and soon, get divorced online. Hi Lukas, welcome on board.
Hi, Audrey. Good to see you guys.
Audrey Tang is Taiwan's digital minister. She became Taiwan's youngest minister without portfolio in 2016 when she headed the public digital innovation space. She has been a hacktivist for over 2 decades. She is also a promoter of open source innovation. Hi Audrey.
Hi, and good local time.
I would like to start with you first, Lukas. Why is Estonia a leader in e-governance?
Well, it's interesting when we talk about e-government because sometimes people speak as if Estonia invented the concept, and nothing could be further from the truth. Large governments and small governments in the developed world started digitizing their systems in the 50s. In the developing world in the 60s, they built large mainframes, they digitized their back office. Now, Estonia in the early 90s had just regained its independence from the Soviet Union. And effectively, we didn't have an administrative state to speak of. So we had to rebuild how the state functioned more or less from nothing in the 90s. And so we did it using the technology and the technological paradigms at hand. And I guess we were lucky on the timing because when we started building up our digitization, in our minds catching up with the rest of the world, we were already in the internet era. And so there were basic paradigms of data exchange, end users, that people who digitized in the 70s and the 80s just didn't think about. And the other bit was that we at the time were scrappy and innovative and poor. We didn't have the resources to build the administrative state of Germany or even Scandinavian countries. And so we were constantly asking ourselves in the 90s, how can we achieve the same processes and have the same outcome in a more cost-effective manner? And so the result was that we had a lot of kind of, scrappy duct tape innovation, and a lot of copying. So our identity system and the technology we copied from Finland. It was nothing unusual. We took PKI cards. We linked them to to identifiers in a register, linking people to their identity. The thing we did really well is we got everyone to use it. So we launched an EID scheme that has really high uptake within the population. The same thing with X-Road. I mean, on a technological level, X-Road is a bunch of protocols to authenticate parties with each other and have secure data exchange between them. It's nothing unique, although there are some particular benefits to X-Road that are useful for government. But we introduced it as we were starting to digitize, and so it kind of was, it was sort of an inherent part of the process of digitization was instead of gathering your own data and building your own silo with data, we had this protocol in place. You then ask, well, where can I already get access to data? Where does the public sector already hold something? So we kind of built this once-only principle and the idea that if the government holds data on you in one place, it's accessible to public services. It's also either based on law or consent accessible to private parties and to yourself. We just sort of baked that into how the system was designed. And maybe just to talk to the broader question, because you mentioned the delivery robots, and one of our monikers we like to use is Estonia as a startup country, was of course that the digitization wasn't just public sector. I mean, similarly, a lot of the entrepreneurial people and the entrepreneurial energy that was unleashed, as you always would have in a sort of post-communist situation, in Estonia happened to be unleashed at the time of the internet. And so we had, I'd say, a good sort of bit of luck, which is that Skype was built in part by a number of Estonians. And that kind of told Estonians in the late 90s and early 2000s, look, one way for you to go and do something world-changing from this tiny little country, in a backwater of Europe is through technology. and through a product and service that can scale globally. And that created the inspiration, but also the local capital, the ecosystem that has led to things like delivery robots in the street. And so I think it's, in many ways, it was a question of getting the flywheel going. And now humbly, I have to say I'm building on the shoulders of giants.
So it sounds like it was partly due to a trust in its people, letting professionals like engineers have the liberty to experiment. Now, Estonia's digital development happened in the 1990s, which was also when Taiwan was democratizing and setting up digital systems. So I'm curious, Audrey, how did Taiwan's digital development happen?
Yeah, indeed. In the first presidential election in 1996, by popular vote, I was also helping one of the candidates setting up his websites. So indeed, it goes far back. That candidate didn't win, by the way. But anyway, the candidate that did win the election, President Li Denghui, in 1998, started this whole e-government processes and design. So in addition to what you have just talked about, like widespread broadband connectivity and so on, were in particular shaped by the SARS experience. So it was a coronavirus incident, not as large as this pandemic, but still left a lasting impression, especially on the health sector. Because at the time, people was still considering this newly invented thing called the Digital Signature Act, this idea of a chip with a photo ID and so on. There's a lot of debate in the society. But after SARS, people have come to see a world of difference between a chip ID that lets you automate a lot of those provisions when it comes to counter pandemic vis-a-vis the paper-based one, which was the one that's used in the main Taiwan island. And so after that, we prioritized the universal healthcare system, which still to this day is one of the most trusted system of personal identification in Taiwan. And based on this, we designed, of course, our counter-pandemic effort in the past few years. And between 2003 and now, we mostly focus on taking care of the less connected places in Taiwan, because for people in the large metropolitan areas and so on, meeting face-to-face is not a problem. But because Taiwan is a country with many, many islands, so for the islands that really need broadband, it's not a nice to have, it is a must-have if they want to complete their digital services and so on online. And so we comprehensively work with all the different ministries to empower people closest to the pain. And that has been the main idea, the universal service, universal access, ever since in our e-government plans.
I was just calculating how old you must have been, Audrey, when you put that website up.
15
right?
years old. I already quit junior high school, and I'm already a CIO of a startup. So we call ourselves.
By the way,
yes.
You pointed to one difference. You mentioned, well, people in the cities don't mind meeting face to face. This maybe is a third driver of digitalization in Estonia, which is we're deeply antisocial. And Estonians love to avoid face-to-face contact. So for instance, our online, our census gathering is now completely registry-based. And that fact is very popular because Estonians are grateful that it's one less bit of human contact with some bureaucrat knocking on their door. There's a little humor to this, but I do think that sort of, we hear in some countries that, well, we can't digitize the service because people want to have the face-to-face interaction with the bureaucrats. The old lady wants to come in and sit in the government office and talk to the civil servant and chat about things. And no Estonian would ever identify with that.
I see. So it was it didn't take a pandemic or coronavirus because it's already ingrained in the culture to be as intermediated as possible.
You must have heard the joke, both true for Finns and Estonians, that when the 2 meter distancing was ended, everyone said, thank God we can go back to 3 meters.
That's a new one for me. It's very funny. Yeah.
That's a great point you brought up, Lucas, about building digital services in a seemingly more antisocial generation. I'd love to explore this a little further, since digital services actually require a lot of trust to build. How did Estonia make citizens trust government services?
I think sometimes the trust question is over mystified because a lot of whether people trust a service or not is very practically, does it work and does it convey trustworthiness? We don't think that much about, do I trust my online bank? Because it works fairly well. We have some sense that the engineering behind it is solid. So the starting position actually is you create trust by having a good service and just being able to deliver something. Now then you get into all the questions of data protection and so on, which people should ask about. But in many senses, that's trust that can be lost. And then the question is, what do you do to maintain trust when the inevitable incidents occur, the inevitable challenges happen? And I think there, our answer, both on a technological level, but also on a more of a human and an organizational level, has been transparency. Technological in the sense that people have transparency over what happens to their data, and they can see who's queried it, who's accessed it, what it's been used for. But also organizational, when we have had incidents, when things have gone wrong, we are super transparent and open about it. So some years ago, we had a vulnerability that was discovered in our EID cards. It wasn't, it was an underlying sort of software vulnerability in the chip software. But we had the head of our digital agency and our prime minister doing a press conference within 2 working days of the vulnerability having been disclosed to them, and having the tech teams work overnight to figure it out and come up with a plan to mitigate it. And what that kind of was an example of and reinforced is the sense that when things go wrong, and they do in technology, it's inevitable, the government's going to be transparent and open about it. And so the underlying trust that people have, I think, is less in the technology per se, but in the sort of civic algorithm behind it, which is ultimately the people running things, that they're accountable, that they're transparent. And I think that we are very conscious of the fact that we could lose that trust. So one of my 4 big strategic KPIs that we work on, that we measure, is the percentage of people who don't use technology or digital services because of trust issues. Mm-hmm. It's a small number. For public services right now, it's 4%. And so obviously the question is not how to reduce that. Okay, fewer would be good, but 4 is pretty small. But how do we actually keep that number small given all the ongoing threats and the risks? And I hope we don't become too risk averse around that.
Audrey, same question to you. How did Taiwan build trust in services?
Yeah, that's a great metric to track. I remember during the counter-pandemic days, the Central Epidemic Command Center once had a public trust of, say, 92% of the institutions and so-called civic algorithms we engage in. But I always stress that we thank the 8% because they keep us honest. And if their critiques is not just critiques, but actually comes with working forks, right? Working alternatives to our services, then these inclusive co-creation means that this openness allows us to be more agile, meaning that we can quickly integrate those better suggestions, like better contact tracing ways. And then this agility enables us to be even more open, that is to integrating more ideas from the civil society. So I'm pretty proud of the civil society's ways of both coming up with constructive alternatives, but also when the governmental institutions, for example, the Taiwanese EID system, which was slated to become a general purpose digital signature system, not just like the health or digital service and so on. The civil society basically let us know very factfully that they require these 4 things, like the independent DPA, to happen before we can roll out that. So while it's technologically ready, we hold ourselves to account and say it would require a specific act and an independent DPA for us to roll out this to the ways that are outside of public service. So I'm pretty proud of our interaction with the civil society too.
Both 4 and 8% does seem like a relatively small percentage when it comes to how much of an entire country do not use digital services because of trust issues. And Audrey, you mentioned that the 8% who don't do so keeps you honest. Could you expand on that and talk about how failures can be opportunities to build trust in Taiwan?
Oh, yeah. As I mentioned, the EID and DPA relationship, that's one, right? And also, there was cybersecurity incident during the counter-pandemic times of people's homebrew ways to collect the visitors' information. There was a popular Line app that was collecting the personal data of people visiting a venue, and that suffered a breach. But instead of saying, no, the government must now mandate everybody to use the government systems. We instead invited the civil society to invent what we call privacy-enhancing systems that doesn't keep any personalized data to the venue. And so the 1922 SMS contact tracing was invented by people in the GovZero movement. So basically rephrasing a breach or vulnerability as an invitation for the civil society and for the startup ecosystem to come up with better solutions. That's what we consistently do.
And I want to jump in and say, look, I want to praise what you've done in the last 5 years with involving civil society, and to say this is an area where we need to do more work. Because I mean, the flip side to what I just sort of described in the Estonian story is we're not as innovative and agile today as we were 20 years ago. And I think this is this is a normal universal process. You know, you look at any startup, it scales up, it becomes more bureaucratic, it slows down. The learning process we're going through right now is how do we kind of consciously do these things that were happenstance in the 90s and the early 2000s when we were building things from scratch. And so, you know, there are a lot of cases where we look back at how we did things 20 years ago, and I don't think we're doing as, you know, we're as inclusive today. We're bringing civil society along as much. And, you know, sometimes the obstacles are really prosaic. You have the intent to do it, but then you have, and this is very common, procurement rules that get in the way. So, you know, we had a situation in the pandemic where a friend of mine set up an open source tool to track mask stocks, and he, you know, basically was running on Google, you know, infrastructure. He paid by his own credit card, and he spent 1.5 years working with the relevant agency to see if they could take over the credit card charge, which wasn't a lot. It was literally a couple €100 per year. But at some point, he said, "Guys, like, I've created this like public service, and you're using it. Would you please pay for it?" And they're like scratching their head. I'm like, well, how do we get the procurement rules to pay for this couple €100 a year? So there are a lot of, you know, sort of small things like that where the kind of the processes of government, which I would generalize to the processes of organizations maturing, have to have a countervailing force. And I think, Audrey, you've played that countervailing force in Taiwan very effectively. And we certainly have people who do that here. The thing I'm chewing on, and I'm curious how you're doing in Taiwan, is how do you institutionalize that countervailing force? Because, you know, at some point, you will no longer be the digital minister. You have a raucous democracy, and one of the features of governments is that they, you know, ultimately don't get reelected. So I'm curious how you keep things going.
That's a great question. So the Ministry of Digital Affairs, which was set up 5 years after I became the digital minister without a portfolio, is essentially institutionalizing the ways that I've been pioneering with each ministry sending one point person to the public digital innovation space as a ministry. So the ministry with around 600 full-time staff this year is very much heads down, looking at, for example, how we engage the agile and making it into the procurement template so that it's something instead of you opting in, you must opt out from. So flipping the default. Or, for example, instead of competing in the procurement, the tenders, the vendors by price, they always now compete by value. So we, instead of saying that the lowest bidder wins, it always is someone who are more agile, more open, satisfying more international interoperability standards and so on, win the bid. But the startups, if they can't afford to solve this particular problem, this challenge with 1/10 the price, then we have an extra announcement period before actually opening the tender so that people can come up with innovations and say, oh, I can solve this with a large language model at a fraction of the cost, and so on, right? So basically, by making sure that whatever ad hoc actions we did during the pandemic becomes the new default after people already come and see the results, we institutionalize the participation from not just the civil society, but also the startup community, the independent software vendors and integrators and so on. And this is what allows us to then endorse public code, because only by public code can several different vendors collectively maintain a single system. And that's how we, for example, can then interoperate with the likes of X-Road abroad.
Indeed, resilience and innovation are both important, but they are sometimes in opposition. Resilience means being stable and withstanding challenges, but innovation means responding quickly to new threats. Is it possible to be both resilient and innovative? Lucas, let's hear from you first.
I mean, I think the easy answer is yes, right? The easy answer is that given that the challenges we face today are so unpredictable, then you need to be nimble to be resilient. And we're going to talk a bit about Ukraine later. I mean, we see that in the case of Ukraine, where it's been precisely their innovation that's made them resilient. And similarly, we go back to the pandemic. And we all had to invent new procedures, new processes on the fly. No one took their pandemic. Well, maybe you guys did. You had the SARS experience, but no one in Europe took their pandemic plans out of the drawer and implemented those. And those plans turned out not to be realistic. I think maybe the caveat there, and the thing I was kind of touching on, is whether innovation itself is resilient, which is to say that in a government context, the impetus to innovation is often itself fragile. It's the right set of people in the right place at the right time. And so one of the questions that that I'm asking myself, that I'm asking Audrey about, that I've been asking my colleagues in Ukraine, is right now you've got the stars aligned, you've got a great team, it's doing great things. How do you make the presence of that innovation itself also be nimble? Because I think it's very clear, also be resilient, because it's clear to me that once you've got the nimble sort of agility there, today that makes you more resilient. And we see that in the private sector, we see that in the public sector, we see that across all sort of fronts. They're not in fundamental opposition, but we need to work. We need to work on very consciously marrying them. And I think we have to convince a lot of the people who have been responsible for resilience that this is the case, because a lot of those people in our space look at the things that make you more nimble and they see it as a threat to resilience. So for instance, if we're talking about things like procurements, cloud usage, open source, then the security people whose job it has been to prevent, foreign agents and a whole range of risks that either come from compromise or from a lack of preparedness, they view those processes as undermining that system. And there's a way in which, of course, the system can be built to serve those same resilience ends better and the security ends better, but it requires sort of reconfiguring things a bit. So the outcome, I think, is clear, but how we get there isn't always.
Yeah, I think by deliberately using the word resilience instead of like security or safety and so on, we take on an attitude of, well, assume breach, right? You probably already assume that the supply chain of the open source bill of materials is probably already compromised at some point. So the question we ask ourselves is that, how do we make sure that the attackers, even though they have compromised one of their layers, do not get access, meaningful access on what we call lateral movement. And it requires two things. One, it requires a commitment to zero trust, meaning that your identity, including the biometric, the device, and the behavior pattern, need to be safeguarded by different vendors, so that even if one of the vendors were attacked, the attacker do not simultaneously gain access to the other two defense systems. And then the attacker is exposed. And then you have the time to respond. So to recover quickly from an intrusion doesn't mean to recover quickly from a disaster, because if you design the defense in depth, a successful attack even doesn't need to end up in a disaster. It could be just like a honeypot. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I also believe is that we need to ensure that the good habits, like using biometric for FIDO-based authentication passkeys, not passwords, is more natural and easier to use than the legacy system. Because if the older system is easy to use by habit, people will just continue to use it. So a lot of our work in rolling out T-Road, like the X-Road rollout, is just making sure that this process is easier to authenticate and to initiate, rather than comparing it to the battle days of USB disk or optical media and so on exchange, which is of course not safe at all, but was easy once in a while, right? So what we're trying to do is to make it both swift and safe at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the principles you point to is really important, which is that ease of use and security don't have to be contradicting sort of imperatives. I mean, so when we think about what we've done with identity, for instance, we talk about the functionality, what enables you to do, but it's a security technology, right? I mean, basically what we said is we have, two-factor authentication across the board for all services. And in doing that, we, basically 90% of the identity theft, the fraud cases you have in many countries sort of get cut out and they don't exist. And people have kind of a security, they have this baked in sort of question when they're interacting with someone online, which is, do I actually know you're an authenticated party? And the same thing is true for interoperability, data transfer, what we've done with Xroad. I mean, primarily, it's a security protocol, but effectively, by rolling that out across the board, the effect you have is you've got everyone standardized on the same security protocol, and it becomes a default assumption in when a system is built, which all of your developers and your community building things know. Everyone kind of knows how that works, and then they're not reinventing the wheel of how do I authenticate my users? How do I authenticate the other parties I'm talking to? And it hides a lot of the complexity, because if you're building a system without these infrastructures, you have to know more about identity. You have to know more about data transfer protocols than you do if that is kind of a standardized building block. The only challenge, and this is the one that we avoided with Xroad and identity in our case, but when we look at countries trying to make that shift now, is that there is an upfront cost. And motivating that upfront cost is I think one of the biggest change management issues, because we get into discussions, look, that's great, that's a beautiful vision, but everyone's got their system, everyone's got their protocols, and there's pain to go through to get them to adopt a different set of protocols. And we don't have it in the case of identity and interoperability, but we face those same challenges for other technological questions today. And so what that gets to is, I think the hardest part of my job, it's not the technology, it's the change management. It's building the coalitions and getting people comfortable with the fact that they have to be changing, and not just with a particular set of changes, but that the general pace and tempo of change is increasing. And again, the funny thing in all this is textbook for anyone in the private world, from the small startup to the large corporation. Mm-hmm. Part of the issue with government is we haven't had to figure this out in the same way that much of the corporate world has. And I think there's one very simple reason. It's competition. Mm-hmm. If you are, forget the startups and the Googles of the world. If you're a bank, you're a retailer, you have already lived in a world for 5 to 10 years, thanks to smartphones and the internet, where your competitors are going to use your poor user experience, your poor use of data to clean your clock, to take away your customers and your business. And we have, plenty of examples in real life where the difference between two banks, it's, the reason customers go from one to the other, it's not because the interest rates are better, the fees are lower, they go because the UX is better, which is, if you think about it, it's the 21st equivalent of, well, this bank has a branch near me and that bank doesn't. So that's, if you were trying to run a consumer-focused business in the private sector, you have to learn this or you go out of business. And we don't. I mean, e-residency and, extreme cases of, migration and so on are the edge fringe cases where people maybe do migrate and you do compete for customers. But generally, we don't engage in that much competition for our users. For Taiwan and Estonia both, the rest of the world is so bad at public sector digital services that certainly no one's left Estonia because our e-government isn't perfect, even though, I'm super critical on a lot of the things we do, because, if I hold up the standard of other governments, then there are a couple other governments in the world who, one thing or another have beaten us and we need to learn from. So, when it comes to some of the things you've talked about, Audrey, I'd say we have to learn from you. There are things we're learning from Ukraine. There are a couple of other governments I look at and say they do A, B, C better. And probably broadly, we're in a kind of a basket of countries and regions. There are a lot of regions within larger countries that are doing incredibly well, but no one's really sort of a sovereign leader fully ahead of everyone else. But then I look at random private sector organizations, all three telcos in Estonia. I say, what's their UX? How are they using data? How open are they to sort of interesting collaborations with startups? And they clean our clocks. And, the fact that it's all three telcos or, it's any given sector, all the participants says to me, it's not that there's some unique special sauce that they figured out. It's just sort of their organizational setup, their domain leads to these kind of impetus to change and leads them to use these tools in a way that we can't organize ourselves in government to do as well. So that is sort of still the thing I'm trying to hack, and what's behind this question of how you institutionalize Audrey, how you institutionalize in Ukraine Mikhailo, and people like this, because I don't think it's going to come from ourselves competing with each other for our people. That sounds like a fairly dystopian world.
That was really insightful. Thank you, Lucas. After all, digital services are services for the people. On a similar train of thought, Audrey, I want to ask you, how do we encourage governments to be innovative and open to change?
Well, in a sense, the participatory processes, such as participatory budgeting, is a kind of competition in the public sector. Right? The proposals need to think of new ideas, like in the presidential hackathon, that align with the SDGs. They have to prove using impact certificates and like social impact bonds and so on, that their ideas actually work. So except, of course, the customer, the funding comes through the public sector's allocation algorithm, but otherwise it recreates the same competition factor when it comes to the private sector vis-a-vis the public sector. So I think a lot of our mechanism design work is to introduce new funding mechanisms that are not simply a committee making the grant application decisions, nor simply a crowdfunding where people with a lot of money can afford to like be the angel for many projects, but rather through like quadratic funding, also called plural funding. We ask people to crowdfund, but the more people crowdfund, the more their dollar counts when it comes to the matching funds from the government. So I think, yeah, we do need to work through this collaboration with civil society with an economic model that makes it lucrative for a startup to think about the public sector use cases and fund them well, so that their ideas can, of course, also benefit the private sector, but then it also solves our own urgency when it comes to competition, because a little bit in Estonia, but a lot more so in Taiwan and Ukraine, there is real competition going on when it comes to the geopolitical. Yeah.
Thank you to Lucas and Audrey for joining us today. We've been talking about digital governance in Estonia and Taiwan, and we'll continue the conversation in the next episode. And if you like today's episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and let us know what you think. See you next time on Innovative Minds.
And so that's just an inevitable part of the process. And I think what I have faith in my Ukrainian colleagues, but what will be hard for them is to keep that momentum going. And I think it's true for a lot of these efforts, is how we keep the momentum going. How do we do it when it's not existential? Because if we're constantly in an existential threat, the problem is our limbic systems can't handle it. If you're running on adrenaline all the time, at some point you crash and you collapse. And that's not a very kind of humane way to do things. Hi, I'm Lucas Ilves. See you on Taiwan Plus.
Hello, I'm Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister. See you on Taiwan Plus.